King Arthur in America. The stories of King Arthur and his knights have long fascinated readers, young and old alike. Some of America's most prominent writers and artists, from Mark Twain to Howard Pyle to F. Scott Fitzgerald to John Steinbeck, have treated the legends in their work. The influence of the legends extends well beyond into literature and American popular culture. From the early 20th century youth group, the Knights of King Arthur, which became a model for Sir Baden-Powell's Boy Scout movement, to advertise architecture, food, products, toys, games, graphic novels, comic books, popular music, and of course, television and the movies. Beginning with early silent films, like Thomas Edison's Knights of the Square Table, or The Grail, 1917, over the years, in fact, the Arthurian legends have influenced some of America's most iconic figures, from Frank Lloyd Wright and Charles Lindbergh to John F. Kennedy and even Elvis Presley. Most people know that already, but here's something that most people do not know. In AD 562, Britain was struck by a comet, or the planet Mars maybe. This great catastrophe that devastated and destroyed most of the great island. The majority of the large population, between 9 and 10 million, were annihilated. The lands were contaminated and diseased, and it was death to enter these great wastelands for around 7 to 11 years. And I wonder, what must have been going on to cause that? I mean, land, as far as I know, doesn't get diseased. I think it was probably a very high electrical potential, and going out you could possibly get electrocuted. That's just what I think. This gigantic disaster is one of the major events in British history. It is probably the cause of the Roman Church insisting that no stone could ever fall from heaven onto planet Earth, until the Church was compelled to admit the truth when a large shower of meteorites landed near the French village in AD 1803, and Velikovsky covered that in Worlds in Collision. I remember reading it. Two things then happened as the Anglo-Saxon and Jute people swarmed into empty and largely depopulated lands, where the survivors were struggling to restore their devastated and destroyed country. This was to become ludicrously known as the Anglo-Saxon Conquest. The second disaster was the arrival in coastal eastern Britain of Austin in AD 597, sent from Rome to preach Catholicism to the immigrant pagan Angles and Saxons. I'm wondering where they would get a name like Angles and where they would get a name of Saxons. Often wondered that. Rome was seizing the opportunity to get into apostolic Christian Britain. They were pretty much Gnostics. The religious wars that went on for centuries were about to commence. The word religious war, I don't know, it's kind of an oxymoron. In the confusions of destruction and widespread disease resulting from these comet impacts, King Arthur II had evacuated the army to Brittany. Brittany and Normandy were British territories until AD 952. He returned to Britain as the diseases abated. His brother had sailed west in search of new lands. In his History of the Franks, then living Gregory of Tours, a contemporary writer, records that the two islands in the sea, Britain and Ireland, were on fire from end to end at a date which is easily fixed at 562 AD. This would be the disaster resulting from the comet debris striking large areas of Britain and Ireland. King Arthur and his voyage to America and his burial. Madoc Morfarn, the Cormorant, some of these words are really hard to pronounce for me, a brother of Arthur II, had sailed west in search of new lands, which might be a place where people could live. In AD 572, Madoc returned after 10 years, that's a long time, and detailed the discovery of America. In AD 573, Admiral Gwynedd sailed to confirm Madoc's star reckonings, and in 575, Arthur II, Madoc, and Amwen sailed in a 700-ship fleet for America. All this is absolutely provable, and again, bad news for Rome. The Gwarchan Mildrew and other records place the Prince Madoc being at sea for 10 years, and so on. And so, from 562 to 572, there is an array of physical evidence and inscriptions in the Collbran alphabet on the east coast and midwest of North America. Maelgwn was then elected in AD 580. In AD 574, Arthur is said by Taliesin to have been ear towards that which is beyond. America for 4 years. This brings us to 578, when he was assassinated. There's not very much on that. I wish there would be more, but there isn't. Then this body was kept under an overhang for the winter and brought back to Britain in the spring to summer of 579 for burial. This is clearly the best recorded funeral in British ancient history, which is why Arthur II is claimed to be untraceable. Melweg was then elected in AD 580. Everything fits in good place from data in these records. So there were 2 powerful kings named Arthur, and to avoid the enmity and wrath of London and Rome, these were welded together into one great king. Burial of Arthur II. And that's what we're going to hear. So I hope you enjoyed the show. I just wanted to fill you in on the history there. Shifu Ramon will regale us with how this all came about. I'm all ears and I can't wait to hear. So without further ado, here's Ramon.
Looking at the ruins that are on the rocks. So they weren't looking at it from a plasma script sort of perspective. They were looking at it from a diffusion perspective, coming out of England, Wales. And they had good reason for that, because the runes here are translatable, and there is a culture called the Fort Ancient that they do not understand exactly why these people changed from the Hopewell into the Fort Ancient culture. And although they use conical mounds, there is a difference in the behaviors of the Fort Ancient culture versus the Hopewell, and it's very mysterious. And they're also a very defined area, starting at the Falls of the Ohio and coming over into the central of Kentucky and up into the southern Ohio. Okay, this is really important, and we're going to come back to it.
Okay.
Now, as I was working with them, I started to learn more and more about the work of Wilson and Blackett.
Okay.
And Wilson and Blackett, they are kind of, in my mind, amateur legends. They went forward and did Arthur research using the Welsh stones, and came to amazing conclusions, and then even found the headstone of King Arthur. And they published a book on it. They just followed it all like the breadcrumbs, So they would just follow the trail, and they would come to the conclusions that they would come to. I'm going to change to not speakerphone because my family's making a lot of noise.
I don't hear anything, but okay.
Well, I know, but it's there. Okay, so along somewhere in there, I started to learn about the electric universe stuff, and I started making my own discoveries. Some things started to overlap.
I was going to ask you about that.
Yeah, and so as I'm reading Wilson and Blackett, I start thinking about what they're really doing in terms of the cosmic hill and the Saturnian myth. And now comes to the thing that really threw me, which I did not know, that Camelot was a bastardization, or a kind of a derivative through the French of the original words in Cumric, Caer Melon, where Caer is a hill fort, and Melon means yellow brown, kind of a yellow brown, exactly like the color of Saturn. Yes. Now, I started to think about the potential of looking at the entirety of the Arthurian tradition, which is derived out of Troy. The whole reason they were called Brits is because of Brutus of Troy. This entire tradition may have been a very ancient Saturnian tradition that was displaced due to cataclysms and such, and that fled up that way, later on becoming Christian, of course, by the time of Arthur. And but early Christian, right? Not anything like we would recognize, but definitely Christian nonetheless. And that this culture had ancient throwbacks to the Saturnian myths, the Talbot type myths, right? So this paper that I wrote is all about that, and I'm relying upon the works of Wilson and Blackett, because took the time to get access. Now, a lot of people out there are going to have doubts about the Arthur tradition. I want to say, first of all, that whole saying, where there's smoke, there's fire, is definitely something I believe when it comes to myths. That if you have a myth, I am likely to believe that there is an origin for that, and I do not believe in, like, for example, people will say Jesus is there was a school of people and they're trying to convey this and that, and so they invented the perfect man. That kind of conspiracy theory, I think, has no basis. It's pure conjecture.
I believe every word. Right.
Much likely, you start with a seed of something and it becomes something else.
Mm-hmm.
The Tao Te Ching was probably written by a man who may have been Lao Er, we don't know, but he probably wrote the first 2 verses. We know he didn't write all 81. You can tell that because the writing style changes, the penmanship style changes. We have now older copies of the Tao Te Ching, and we know for sure that it was modified between the oldest copy that we now have and the copy that everyone was relying upon for thousands of years. But that doesn't change the fact that at some point there was probably a guy, Lao Tzu. And same thing with Shakespeare, same thing with Homer. I have no doubt that there were original people who were the source of these stories.
Mm-hmm.
And Arthur is no less the case. In fact, there's a lot of evidence for Arthur. There's this entire thing that I didn't know about called the Land of Charter.
Mm-hmm.
The Land of Charters are the notes located in the margins of the Bible at the Land of Church in Wales, which chronicle land exchanges and title exchanges and other things that are political and church-state related between Arthur II's family and the church. So, for example, his grandfather, Tewdrig, who we would call Theodoric in English, was excommunicated at one point for killing his own brother, and for a few years was an excommunicated patron. Then was brought back into the church and enabled to be forgiven, and then by the time he dies becomes a saint. He does this by donating land for the church, because at that time the kings controlled all the land, and the church had to receive charters for their.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so this was not the typical way we look at the Roman Catholic Church. This was a much more contractual system, and so there was a lot of religious politics involved at that time between Arthur's family and the other. Now, there's more to the story in terms of which Arthur, because there's a 300-year gap in the stories of Arthur conquering Romans and then even penetrating into Europe and beating the Romans on their own turf before coming back to Britain. And then the Arthur who we have in the Land of Charters. So as it turns out, there's 2 Arthurs here.
Okay.
One is Arthur, and one is Arthwis.
Uh-huh.
It's called them Arthur 1 and 2. Now there's 2 other ones, but they're named after Arthur II and Arthur I, because these were Arthurs that were, let's see if we can create, if you name the second one after the first and it turns out really well, then maybe the third one will, be the next come. But it wasn't to be. I mean, long term, the immigration of Germanic peoples and Nordic peoples to the region, to the island, and to particularly England, Logres, there was just too much coast for the kingdoms in Glamorgan and Gwent to control. But they controlled the best port, and so for a long time they were able to hold it. Now, how were they able to hold it? Unlike where Caesar encountered people who would give up fairly easily, they used these systems of hill forts. And these hill forts were arranged in rings, which provided for mutual defense. And so let's see what page we can see. We're going to skip ahead of that and then come back.
Okay.
Okay, so page 7 contains the Caerleon fort system example.
Okay.
Now, the Roman site in the center there by the River Usk is what people claim is a Arthurian age, but the problem is it was built on flat ground and it's in a square and it's obviously Roman. The real Carleon is over to the west of that, and
Okay.
it's up on a hill. All of these sites that you see here are all hills, and they arrange them in a ring. Okay, now the thing that blew me away is that there is a couple of these rings which are in a hexagon shape.
Hmm.
Now,
Yeah.
that's a convenient shape. That's a convenient strategic shape, but it is also a shape that's associated with Saturn.
Yes,
Now,
it is.
going back to Camelot itself, if you go back up to page 2,
Okay.
Wilson and Black had identified a large egg-shaped hill, and roughly egg-shaped, which is also near one of the only natural springs in all of Wales, which is a sulfur spring. So now they have a yellow spring next to an egg-shaped hill, which has references to this day to the yellowness, and we believe that there are ruins that have that were there and then also have been removed by archaeologists. And they step through it in their books. So I definitely recommend people to get their books. If you have trouble, we can. I know the guy who has the copyright currently. We can help you get the books. I obviously definitely recommend if you can find a copy of Artorius Rex Discovered. Also, the King Arthur Conspiracy is another one.
Okay.
But they tend to be expensive books, but believe me, they're worth it. And so using that, we actually went and scanned this hill and got a good, and it's a strategically powerful place. This is where if you wanted to put Camelot anywhere, you would definitely put it up there. I learned from their work that the round table was not just a physical table, but it was a concept of all these kings come together. They weren't knights at all. They were kings, and they all had their own hill forts, in which they were kings over the lands around them. And they would come together and they would elect a high king. Arthur II's family was descended from Arthur I, who was descended from Brutus of Troy, right?
Yeah.
So they had the most legitimate claim going back. So again, the concept, the archetype of the father begetting the son comes again. I think most people are familiar with that concept from our own, heir, believing in inheritance. But originally, that is coming from the exchange of energy, the plasma exchange, going from Saturn to Jupiter, and then from Jupiter to I think Mars. But at any rate, so a lot of this paper I talk about the real King Arthur myths versus what have come down to our romantic beliefs. If you look on page 4, there's a table. I apologize. The dynamic family tree that is cited there was removed by Genie, and so if you want to see the family tree, you're going to have to stick with the static version in their books. And then here's another correction. There were 4 Arthurs, not just 3. I learned later there was a 4th one, but you get the point. So you have Arthfail and Arthwis, and then Arthfail II. So these are 3 different King Arthurs. And then he had multiple Guinevere wives. And you have, the just various things about Merlin and, his battle with Mordred, all of that stuff, which is real. And then there's other things that are just completely made up, and they're part of the romantic. So we've been completely tricked in our culture into what we should believe.
Yep.
And I can't underestimate the power of that to control a culture's understanding. Now, the reason why this happened is after the Welsh were finally defeated by the English, they were still difficult to control because they had their own language. So in the late Middle Ages, it was made illegal for them to teach or write in Cymric. And in fact, the teachers were removed and only English teachers were installed. The entire country was taken over by the import of royal blood from England, from Anglo-Saxon. So they weren't defeated. They weren't defeated militarily. They were defeated politically and with savvy, which is
Yeah.
smart.
Yeah.
because they had learned from the Romans a lot of strategy that was really quite brutal. I mean, one example is they would surround the Picts, and then they would build a wall around the Picts, and they would make a fortress out of them, and then starve them to death, which is a really smart technique. But they were just really difficult to attack. So instead, they were defeated with political cunning and savvy. Ever since, Wales has always been part of the United Kingdom. But they were not allowed for a long time to have their own teachers and teaching that language. And so to this day, very few people, not the majority of people in Wales will speak the Cymric. However, the names of the places and things there are still they're strange. I mean, there's romanicized versions, anglicized versions of the names. Like I mentioned, Tewdrig is Theoderic, and Muerig, his son, is Maurice, and of course, as I mentioned, Arthwis is Arthur. On page 5, you can see the names of these British kings on the left in the Welsh stones. Okay, these are stones that are carved. They're often strewn about the countryside and left in carports at churches, just laying around for anyone to walk up and see in Wales. And then you can see that there are analogs of Roman names over on the right. And now a lot of people are going to say, well, these don't seem similar enough, but some of them are uncanny. And so what if it's possible that for a while the Roman Empire was controlled there at Glamorgan and Gwent? It's possible. I'm not making that assertion, but they are apparently. The bottom line, though, is that I feel that there is a strong connection of the Saturn myth and the legitimacy of the original line of kings. And in fact, that this line of kings knew also about North America, which is going to come in handy later. In terms of looking at the on page 10, you can see on the cover, you can see the headstone that they found, which, by the way, is now in America. It's been shipped out of England because, again, I know the guy who purchased the copyright. Well, he also got the stone because the government there would not declare that it was legitimate, and so it couldn't be called a historical artifact. In order for them to call it a historical artifact, they'd have to admit that it was legitimate, and so they wouldn't. So now it's been shipped, and it's in America. And if people want to get involved in getting that stone displayed, George is always looking for help. So please reach out to me. Now, you can see Camelot is put in that image in figure 3 in the center of many different forts, and this is adjacent to the Caerleon system. So I think also that they would move about and reestablish these ring systems, if that makes sense. Like that they would have different ages of a hill fort system. But I think that they probably started off with the hexagon in mind, or other shapes like squares, the square and circle motif, the asymmetric octagons, and then they would move along. Of course, they have to build, using the hills that are most important. Figure 5 on the next page, I'm just talking about the cosmic mountain, and different cultures having different names, but it's one of the most ubiquitous, every culture having a cosmic mountain. And I want to point out that in China, the king himself is associated with the color yellow, right? And this is more than one king associated himself with yellow. So this is why we think that Carmelon has to be in the center of the rings, because it would be the safest place for the High King.
Okay.
In order to survive, and then he would have to go and inspect all the different hill forts and kind of wander about. That would put him in danger. But in general, once the inspections are done and everything is all the commerce is flowing correctly, going to the center, Camelot would be truly be a shining hill on a fort on a hill.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it wouldn't be a big Norman-style castle with big, thick walls. It would be a little bit more porous because A, the technology wasn't as high then as it is in the Dark Ages, and B, we'll talk about the Dark Ages in a second, but B, the political system, when they would be invaded, they would pull all the people into the cities, and then they would themselves use horses and cavalry to defend the plains, so the fighting would be kept away from the hills as much as possible. So
Mm-hmm.
they didn't need big, thick. Now, as for Dark Ages, I want to understand, and this I learned after studying from Michael Crichton, ironically enough. The Dark Ages were not really dark in terms of lamplight or something. They were dark because of the withdrawal of the Roman Empire, and so dark to us because we are the culture descendant of the Anglo culture, which is descendant of the Roman culture, right?
Okay.
And so there were other empires that had occupied those regions in Europe, like the Gauls and the Visigoths, etc., and they made technological advancements because in the realm of war is or milling and granaries and things like that. So they made progresses. It wasn't completely dark, and it was also scientifically dark, but almost everywhere in the world was really, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So the castles in Glamorgan and Gwent were not as advanced. And that's also why we don't find as much of them. You can still, though, go and find these stone walls that go around these hill forts up on the hills. When they haven't been destroyed and the neighborhood put up, you can find all that information still around. The stones, some of these churches that are more than 1,000 years old, sometimes almost 2,000 years old. And you can see where they had the church and then they moved it over here because they were building with stones, but they weren't necessarily building like ancient Egypt here. I mean, some of this stuff I mean, it's really quite how would you say primitive compared to the Dark Ages kind of forts that we're used to. And the Roman stuff and the Norman stuff is what survives the ages. So the archaeologists look at it and go, well, this must be the real, origin. So Arthur must have been a Roman soldier. That's all nonsense.
Yeah.
It's in the actual Welsh stones, who he
Yeah.
was, who his family is, and the whole tree is available. And Wilson and Blackett have in the text found all this information going back well beyond. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to think if there's anything else in this paper that's absolutely necessary to talk about. No, I get into a lot of stuff that is, just talking about Egypt and talking about the cosmic eye.
Mm-hmm.
There, of course, are connections to various father-son gods. And on page, looks like 23, I give an example of a situation where I have a map I created of the Arthurian, I guess the hill forts there in Wales. And I had predicted that if this was a hexagon system, there should be a fort in this circle. And guess what? Someone gave me as a gift another one of their books, and there is exactly a fort right in that system that we could open up the map even and show people. My map is technically public. It's, of course, being a Google map, it has a very long hashtag. I don't have a short. For the Hidden Kentucky project, I have a short, URL, but not for the other map. I can get it to you, and you can
Yeah.
share, and
Yeah.
people can explore
I
the
just
Google
put
map.
it in the video.
Yeah, but I mean an actual dynamic Google Earth map that they're
Okay.
actually able to scroll around themselves. We'll get
Okay.
you the link, and then you can put that in.
Yes.
I mean, it is really a lot of fun because it also has the Welsh stuff that we found in America.
Okay.
So, anyways, I was able to predict using the Saturn myth where I thought a hill fort should be, and then lo and behold, in another Wilson and Blackett book, there was a hill fort in that area.
Excellent.
I call it a vague hexagon.
Yeah.
And I just want to point out that the authority here that we're talking about is not much different than the Chinese concept of the will of heaven. And then, of course, you get into the floating island and the towering castles in the sky and all those kinds of ideas that harken to the Arthurian myth. I end this with conclusions, question mark, because after all, it is a lot of mystery. We don't know enough. There's not enough research in the Arthurian tradition in terms of legitimate belief in him as a real person by academics. There is another work by Dr. Robert McCann, and he approaches it as a scholar should, as if he's a real person, and he goes through the myths. And of course, he's contemporary now, so he's able to get away with more. He is out of Oxford, and so he's able to look at it now. Now that the walls are coming down because the internet, because there's more freedom now in the West than there was 20, 30, 40 years ago to talk about these things openly. And now for him, he starts Arthur in the north of Wales, but still Wales, not England. Folks, there was no Winchester at the time, right? That's all lies that have been put out by tourist agencies and English propaganda, because they needed to steal the myth in order to keep it the power for themselves,
Right.
to rob the original people of their independence, right?
Yes.
These Celtic peoples that had a kingdom. They had a kingdom in Glamorgan and Wales, but they considered themselves the masters of the whole island, right?
Mm-hmm.
From the first Arthur, they had conquered they felt the whole thing, and then Ireland, and then Brittany over in the north of France was part of theirs. They controlled all those sea lanes, and they were fantastic seafarers and horsemen.
Okay.
And then over time, they granted lands to the Picts. And then the Anglos and the Saxons arrived, and the Nordic peoples, and sometimes they made war on them, and sometimes they let them go. And in the end, that did cost them, because the Visigoths were able to pierce right up, and the Vandals, right, go on up the middle, and cut the island in half. And eventually they could no longer consolidate their power anymore. The world moved beyond the technology that they had. They were like the Chinese. They stayed in this old belief system, and this old belief system goes back to the reign of the above God. Okay, so now it's time for us to click on. I don't know if yours shows it, but mine shows related papers on the right. It says Uchel the High Lord. If yours doesn't say that, you can click the back and just go find Uchel.
Where's it at?
You could just click back and then go find it.
Okay. All right.
If you control F, UC8.
Control F. I got to remember that. That's handy. And then type in what now?
UCHEL.
Yep. And Shangdi?
Yeah, Shangdi. Shangdi it means the above God in the Chinese. All right, so now here's where things get really fascinating. There's an argument from the Victorian anthropologists and linguists that, not that Kumaric isn't real, but that Collbran, the script, is not real. That Morgan Yolo invented this alphabet. Now, Morgan Yolo was a bard, and his tradition as a bard is to go around and collect stories and embellish the stories and add to the stories and sing the stories and receive patronage for the singing of stories around the fire and in the halls and etc. That's his job, you know. It's not an academic job. It's a job of a man who's a bard. Now, he had to have something to base it from. So he had already a series of scripts, and then he added to those scripts, which is in order those runes. And the reason he did that was to improve the tradition. He was an excellent bard. He was quite a character, as all the great bards are. And he did make up stories. But there are also things that were obviously real Welsh myths that had come down from the ages. And just like Sequoia was, claimed that he invented an entire alphabet, this is impossible. It's just not a thing that people. I mean, you and I can invent an alphabet. It doesn't mean anybody's going to use it. Okay,
Right.
This is an alphabet that already existed. So I wanted to show that through the plasma script. So this is my theory when I set out to write this paper, that the Collbran, like the Chinese scripts, which I had already through a series of papers talking about sumo, talking about Shangdi and Dao, Shangdi, Heaven and Dao, talking about later on a Tai Chi paper, talking about these things, that there is a connection between these ancient scripts and the Saturn myths, and that these are plasma scripts. But now here's the logic. If these scripts, just like Hebrew and possibly Egyptian, come from symbols in the sky,
Right.
then that establishes, because we know the scripts in China are real, that the Collbran is real too. You follow me?
Yes.
If there are scripts that show up in both, even though they're across the worlds from each other, and we are not maintaining that the Welsh and the Shang of China are related, then there is a reasonable suspicion that Collbran is a real runic system, which would make the Welsh language legitimate and all their stories legitimate, and then all of those archaeologists can go jump off a bridge, okay? Because they are lying to people, and
Right.
they're perpetuating a myth that is, you can't say racist, but it's definitely ethnist, right? It's an ethnocentric lie that Arthur is not real, or that if he's real, he must have come out of England, which is not true. Okay, Logris was a land controlled by them, but they owned it, not that he was there. They were in Glamorgan and Gwent. Okay, so stepping through the paper, I just talk about different things. We're going to come back to the discussion about in America. But I do go into the Collbran alphabet. You can see the Collbran alphabet first set of runes on page 4, and you might even recognize some of them.
Mm-hmm.
Look there. There's the U and the Y you have your asymmetric turkey foot, and then you have your Awen glyph, and they are two different runes in Collbran. Okay,
I see that. Yeah.
In North America. Okay, remember they were showing up, and then if you look though, the Y is the upside down of the T and TH, and these are showing up in the Ohio River Valley. You saw those when we covered the stones in the last parts.
Yes.
Okay.
Amazing.
All right. So yeah, it's really
just
quite
amazing. Yeah, it blows my mind.
On figure 4 on page 6, we have an example of something that has been thrown under the bus by the mainstream archaeology,
Of course.
by people who didn't know anything about Welsh tradition, as a complete fabrication. On the left is the original, and then the right is the wax replica of the Grave Creek stone.
Okay.
Okay. Now they can't translate that with anything else but Collbran. Nothing else. This is found in America. Okay.
Wow. Yeah.
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 All right,
this is all new to me. So
Yeah, I
Don't
understand.
worry about my lack of response. I'm just wowed.
Well,
So,
on page 7, you can see Wilson and Blackett step through, and then they start to actually, in the King Arthur conspiracy, they cover these different stones that are found in America that have no translation according to archaeologists because they're forgeries, they're fakes, they're hoaxes, elaborates. They never conformed at all to Ogham and Hebrew and all this stuff. Well, that's true because they're not Ogham or Hebrew. They're Collbran,
yeah.
and you can read them in. Now, the things that we are most interested in is on the Grave Creek stone, it refers to the High Lord. That's a concept that we see in China, a god above. And on top of that, when we see the double L, it looks exactly like the symbol for man. Now, anybody who's reviewed my papers will see that the symbol for man, Ren in Chinese, is a direct reference to the great squatter, uplifted man in the sky,
Mm-hmm.
which everybody else is familiar with from the Thunderbolts project, right?
Mm-hmm.
It is what would you say, a reduced version, and it looks exactly the same. It's just flipped. And why should it be flipped? Because it's on the other side of the world.
Yeah.
You understand? You see what
Yes.
I'm getting at?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so the LL symbol for High Lord is the same word. The Lord is the same word as over there in China. But Ren become mankind, but originally started off, it meant the man, the above man, up in the sky.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and over time became mankind, but in over here, as the symbol was simplified, it became Lord, as in the Lord.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, I also want to point out that the
Interesting.
X gross, that X also shows up in the Chinese. Of course it does because it's just an X. But the point is, later on, we see that the cross is also associated with wind. Okay. But the main point here is that we're looking from the Grave Creek stone at the Uchel. All right. So step to figure 6 on the next page, you can see the etymology of mankind in Chinese. And you can see that we are getting different references to it looks like a thunderbolt.
Yes.
Right. But also there is over there on L31206, you can see the man who looks like he's bending over, and you can also see the legs of the god. And we start to see these plasma scripts. And of course, in this paper, I don't spend a long time going over that stuff because I covered it all in another paper, Shangdi, Heaven and Tao. So if people want to know about that, they should look at the Sumo paper and the Shangdi, Heaven and Tao paper, and all about the Shangdi and the origins of those symbols. I do mention them down below. They're on page 8. Gao, Da, and Tai. Tai is interesting because, you can see Da has the great man with the one line above, but then Tai, which means the highest or greatest, has a little penis. Now the penis, the little penis there, is also in the word de, as in Dao De Jing. And that de, when you look at the etymology for de, you find 2 spheres that are connected with some kind of like thing. And it does look like a scrotum. And if you recall, Zeus castrated Kronos, right? And he lost the 2 testicles. But it might have been that there was a plasma stream that was streaming between them, and then that was cut off and ended.
Yes.
So there's all these phallic references. All right, so you can see the etymology of big or da there in figure 7 on the next page, and you can see most definitely that is our squatter man.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
There you go. I mean, very
sure.
J23-197. Okay, so we're looking for the similarities here with the other. Now, if you scroll down on Figure 7, you can see also some of the origins for the above are clearly the boat motif with something in the center.
Yes.
What is that something in the center? If you referred back to the last paper we were just looking at, in Kentucky, we have a relief that is a hexagon shape with a raised a central sphere, and we know it's a partial sphere because when you look at a ball at a direction, you don't see half of the ball. You see like maybe the top 1/3.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and that's exactly how that relief is done. And so here, what I'm speculating is that that dot is Mars, and that the crescent is exactly as Dave Talbot has described. It is the glowing coming from below, and it's able to rotate. Okay, and then that symbol, the above God. So we know that the Shang here is describing originally Saturn, and then has come to signify the Lord. And you can also see some of these look like a person in prayer. Mm-hmm. So you have a signifying a person who is subject to that Lord. Yes. When you get down to the next page, you have D, and you have symbols in D. You can see the hexagonal aspect, but you can also see some of the etymology for heaven, which because D has the Tien symbol in it, which means heaven, and so you have in Tien you have the etymology. You can clearly see now we have the Squatterman undergoing some kind of electrical phase change, and possibly references also to the Thunderbolt. It's not exactly clear there. I think perhaps a Peratt instability.
Yes.
As it was developing. Okay. All right. Are you following with me so far?
Oh yeah.
About looking at the Chinese. We're looking at the Chinese because it's A, legitimate. B, we have a timetable that has been set. Of course, I think it's been too compressed, and that the old Chinese reading of the dates is probably more correct. But at least it can be dated. And in some cases, it does correspond. You know, the end of the Shang seems to correspond with the Hopewell very well.
Makes sense.
Formation of the Adena Hopewell Lake people. So you know, whatever events inspired one culture may have inspired the other culture. Being the point. And the other thing is that the plasma scripts are in excellent shape coming out of China, whereas over here, unless they carved it in rock, or in the Isles, unless they carved it in rock, it's not likely to be found because they wrote on perishable materials, whereas the Shang were carving these things on turtle bones and deer bones and things like that. Right? They were carving on shells and whatnot. So they did burn them, though, just like everybody. They burned these plasma scripts because it was a purification. I was just watching about the Story of India, Michael Wood, and they have a festival there that's a 12-day festival in southern India to the fire god, and then at the end they burn everything. And the language of the poem that they're singing for those 12 days is undecipherable. They don't know what it means. Certain parts of it they know, but a lot of it they don't know what it means to this day. So which means it goes back to a very far age. Okay. So when we get into here in Kentucky on page, well, let's go back actually. Let's go back up to I had a map that showed the different coins.
Yes, that was interesting. I saw that.
Yeah, I want to make a point about that. The archaeologists claim, they do not claim that these coins are forgeries, because that would be impossible. What they claim is that they brought back by World War II veterans. But I want you to look at something. Are they saying that only veterans who went to Europe came from the eastern part of the United States, and that only veterans who, I guess, went to the Pacific were in the West Coast? Because I don't think that's how that works.
No.
Okay.
Yeah,
these coins were found here because the Great River, that is the Ohio River, and merges in the Mississippi, that great river was the greatest river in North America. And all these are sea lanes, highways to economic values. And these Roman coins have been found in the interior of Kentucky and then North Carolina and Tennessee and Georgia. This is not an accident.
No, we didn't think so.
Right?
Right.
This is not people dropping their who brings back a Roman coin from Europe, and all these veterans are bringing them back and then going to the river and dropping them out of their pants. I mean, it doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
So these are legitimate finds, and they're legitimate because the Welsh were here early on, and we see this in the ruins. And by the way, there is evidence of destruction of stone forts in America. If you look on page 2, you can see one such survey done by E.T. Cox in the mid-late in 1874 there. And afterwards, they quarried the site and used the stone to build the Big Four Bridge in Louisville for a railroad, and then sent an archaeologist in the 1890s who claimed he didn't know anything about geology. He claimed that it must be natural, and that he never saw any evidence of human activity. But E.T. Cox and his crew, they were geologists, and they said this is a legitimate human fortification. Now, Rick Osman, who wrote the Graves of the Golden Bear referring to Arthur, has a theory that this was underdone by the American government in order to hide the evidence of the Welsh having been here. And I'll step through some evidence for that conspiracy theory at the end of this little discussion.
Yeah.
So on page 12, here is an example of Shang dynasty-like scripts showing up in Menifee County in Kentucky, 15 MF 355. Okay.
Sure.
Now they'll call on the right there, the figure 11. They'll call that a vulva. It's not a vulva. It's very obviously the 3 rays of the Alwyn turned upside down. Okay, but it's the Collbran name God.
Yeah.
And then the question is, can we translate what's over here on figure 10? I regret to say that probably 15 MF 355 is probably a destroyed site. So if it weren't for Lee and the Ancient Kentucky Historical Association, in fact, that Spratt site that I mentioned at 15 MF 355 definitely was destroyed, the ruins part. I have personally visited the Welsh mounds. There are mounds there that are not conical mounds, like as in the Hopewell, but they are Welsh mounds, like you would find in England and all that, in the UK, and they are stone piles. They are fortunately undisturbed, and so the serpent mound that is there that you saw with the running script and the open mouth and all that, and the last time we talked, that is still there, partially destroyed by logging roads. However, the ruins that are on this hillside have unfortunately almost certainly been destroyed, almost all of them. So the job of the Ancient Kentucky Historical Association, going out there in the 80s, the 70s, 80s, 90s, and photographing these is really important. And we'll probably not get any notoriety. They provided a survey to the University of Kentucky, and they still didn't protect the site. Now, what kind of symbols do we see? We see a bowl motif. Well, we know that from the Venus Smith. We see the hands uplifted to the sky. We see the cosmic pole with the sphere on top of the oblate sphere. We see the ram's head or bull horns, if you will, and the cross motif.
Yes, I see that. Yeah.
Yeah, we see all of this kind of stuff. So I list those out, in things 1 through 10. And then going on again at the next page, we see what the archaeologists call nutting holes. Well, what does it look like to you? I mean, to me, it looks like a serpent head, just like we've discussed before, which is a comet tail following a series of spirals, which is, as Wall and Talbot have explained, is due to the rotating of the Earth and the movement of things. The circular nature gives it that undulating.
Mm-hmm.
And they have specified it. I'm not saying it can't be constellations, but the idea that they are holes for putting in nuts and then grinding them, that there's no pattern to it, is completely laughable. And bear in mind that not a single so-called certified archaeologist has ever came out to that site and truly analyzed the site. And you can see in Figure 14 there are very clear indications of Paradian Z pinching and the upside down script. Now, so is it Welsh people that carved these, or was the site anciently occupied? Later, the Welsh came and visited it for whatever reason. Maybe they were brought there, but they can be translated according to the language of the one religion that was around the world at that time.
Yes.
Stepping through, we can look at the symbol for oneself in Chinese, ge, and how similar it is to the Ren symbol. And what does it look like? It looks like the T rune. Remember that the thunderbolt and the god are the same. The Lord is his power.
Mm-hmm.
I was listening to the Iliad today with the children, and it was talking about his shaft, his arrow, his scepter, and it was all referring to Zeus. The entire, well, in this translation, Jupiter. They were very specifically referring to the God, the Lord, as his power, that as it would descend down and provide destruction. This is in the first chapter of the Iliad. If people get a chance, go listen to it. It can't be missed because there's a plague, and the Greeks think that they have been that their enemy has prayed to Zeus, and that is why the plagues and destruction are happening. Is that he's answering them, and then so they're in all sorts of bad ways, right? Because they've been over in Troy. Well, why have they been over in Troy for 10 years? Because their lands were destroyed, so they took to the sea to go get them. It had nothing to do with a princess. That's just romanticism. Right? The reality is that they had become sea peoples, and they needed a new home, and Troy looked like as good a place as any. Right? Okay, so you could see also in that you could see other kinds of motifs. You got the cross motif, you got the bullhead motif over there on L23675. You've also got sometimes two little T runes. That's probably Saturn and Jupiter, because in some cultures they were considered brothers. Okay. Now, in page 15 here, we see the subject of God in Collbran, and I think this is worth reading out loud to people. So this is from a really great book on ancient Welsh grammar that I found. This is not a Wilson Blackett book. It's a book put out by John Williams, 1856, and the original author from the book was 1530 to 1606. So anybody saying that YOLO created the script in the 1800s can't be right, because the original works were coming from the 1500s and even back to the 600s. Okay, so this is the code of the vocal song. First of all, it must read the letters. The British alphabet is said to be of divine origin. God in the beginning announced his name and said these three lines that we're talking about, which became the T rune. Whereupon all things sprang simultaneously into life and being, and responded to a shout of ecstatic joy. And at the same time, there spread three rays of light, forming the divine name, the first three letters, which were also the source of all letters and sciences. I'll just say Einigan, who was favored with this sight, took 3 rods of mountain rods. We see that in the Bible too, rods of mountain ash, and inscribed upon them the name of the deity. The deity. But the people that mistook the rods, thus bearing his name for God himself, which caused Einigan to die of grief. That sounds a lot like what Moses went through. Okay, now, so what are we hearing here? These runes were cosmic symbols in the sky, and the people were misunderstanding the sound and the light. And the symbols for the actual name. But the origin and reason of all this is discovered to us in the bardic traditions. There we learn that God created the world by the melodious threefold utterance of his holy name, and that the form or figure of that name was that symbol, being the rays of the sun. Of course, this is not correct, right? But that's all this guy could know. At the equinoxes, solstices converging to focus the eye of the light. show God in his various characters as the creator, preserver, and destroyer. The divine name may not be uttered because no mortal man can articulate the harmony of the sound. It is kept a secret lest by the ignorant it be abused and dishonored by the Hindus. This is, the opinion of that author at that time. Formation of the additional letters found are the single one, the triple, and then the upside down version, which is almost like a W, or Yao. Yao. So there you go. Yao, Yahoo, Yahweh, and the Cherokee is Wahoo, and the Yao is in the Chinese. So again, did the Chinese go all the way over to England, or did they hear one sound?
Yeah, that's
forms of the divine name is written. The next page is just merely a close-up of the same image that I had shown before, and you can see the symbols for the above God that are similar in the Chinese, and you can also see that symbol in the lower left, facing down. And in the upper right, we see the so-called centipede glyph. This is not the same centipede glyph that we talked about in Kentucky. This is a different one showing the Z pinching that I mentioned may be the origins of the step pyramid kind of perspective. And then we get to almost the climax here. At the Sprat site on page 17, the next page, there is this carving that was found, of which Lee himself had no explication for until I gave the presentation. That symbol, you can see that I highlighted with green, is almost exactly what you see coming out of the Chinese for the etymology of D, the Lord. Okay? And again, you see it there on figure 8 on the bottom of 17. If you compare figure 8 with what you're seeing here, the only thing you have to add is a pyramid at the top.
Yeah.
And then square at the bottom. By the way, the square in Chinese is a mouth. And what else do we see? We also see a semicircle, which could be the boat or shell motif, but I'd say it's the boat motif.
Yeah.
At the time. Now look at some of the etymologies in the center of figure 20. What do you see?
It's amazing.
The alpha fish. Okay. Now that alpha fish is the symbol for weapon. The alpha and the omega. I am the alpha and omega. How am I the alpha and omega? Because the thunderbolt is the alpha and the omega. The electricity is the alpha and the omega. Okay?
I see, yeah.
It's amazing stuff, isn't it?
Yeah, it's cool.
We see here, I go into some detail talking about the power of the Yao on page 19. I don't want to spend a lot of time on it, but you do see to shake, you see the motif, you see the symbol for sun, you see the symbol for the mankind or the God, the Lord up on the top there. You see also the oblate sphere inside of the square. So you have the circle and square motif. And then over here for anger, if you see there at L2712, you see the dot with a center, which is definitely the sun, and then upraised arms and 2 crosses. Or on the left, there are 2 fireballs coming down with crosses. These are symbols of wind and power, but with upraised arms look like anger coming down.
Yes.
And wrath. I mean, it's incredibly frightening to imagine what that would have looked like.
Yes,
and
I like your reinterpretation of that serpent with the egg. It definitely looks like a comet to me.
Absolutely. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah.
Now coming down, let's see here. We don't need to go through all of these. I mean, you can see some of them are just fantastic. I mean, looking at the word for rain, you can definitely see the deluge happening. I mean, who wants to draw that many dots? It's very obvious that there's that they don't mean a little bit of rain; they mean a lot of rain. There's the eye motif shows up in some of these. The boat motif, the cross, the Maltese cross motif for the sun. We get back to 21, the Venus again showing up here with the bull of heaven, bull of heaven. looks a bit like a comet flying. It's almost unmissable.
It's
And
kind of
then
taking on a penis look too.
yeah, that's true. And my favorites in page 22, we see here two oblate spheroids, and they're in motion, and then they're above each other, and then there's even a shaft of energy going from one to the other, and the transfer. And then we see references to what appear to be genitalia,
Yeah.
right? And then
Amazing.
more comments by the Lu Shu Tong, more flying asteroids and such, right? So
Yes.
I mean, it's becoming very clear, I think, to anybody that's paying attention. By the way, on page 23, there you've got the Venus of Willendorf in the Chinese glyphs, L29782.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting stuff. Also, please note, backwards and forwards, upside down J's are notable in the runes that were found at the Spratt site here in Kentucky.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. Now,
Yes.
let's move on down to. We'll skip all the explication. Okay. Now back to the Collbran on page 25. All right. Now, something that people need to know: there are more runes than the images that I had shown before, and these runes, they're from different periods of time. One of the most important ones is this Tehran. This is an interesting rune, this TH rune. It's obviously related to what we were just discussing, is the symbol for the three rays of the Lord coming down, but it's also a consonant that shows up in several languages. The ta sound for thunder, and obviously Thor and Odin, and of course the word thunder even still showing up over and over again.
Mm-hmm.
And so Tehran is no different here. Tehran meaning undoubtedly a thunder god. So this is really fascinating, this T sound. There is something about that is repeatedly showing up. And then when we get into translations, they translated the Spratt site inscriptions. We do see references to the below and under, and to the place of reverence, and a ruler, and the God, and the power, and the end, and his manifest outward. Now, I can't say for sure that this is a correct translation. I am just saying here you have some of the same concepts that are in the Ramses II Stele. A state of going down, below, under, a god, a two, like the number two, a power, and a manifestation. Right, these are central themes in the Ramses II Stele, which has, if the listener remembers from the previous videos, the Ramses Stele has measurements of diameter, polar and equatorial diameter ratios to Jupiter and Saturn within 1% of satellite measurement. So the story on the Ramses II Stele, and maybe we covered that in another video, the solar orb paper. It's another paper. It's the same information as they're translating with Collbran, the plasma scripts that were carved undoubtedly by natives. And why do we know it was natives? Because the Welsh did not arrive in America till after King Arthur II brought them here because of the comet in 535. But the events that we're talking about were happening during the Exodus and previous. Well, and maybe that's why when they came over, they were able to mingle with the Hopewell and form the Fort Ancient. But whoever it was that originally was in the land, these Elegui, they date antecedent to the Arthurians arriving in Kentucky. and Ohio, in the Ohio River Valley. And we know that they came here because in the Welsh stories, on the stones in Wales, and this is in McCann's book, they make references to otters, bison, Native Americans with headdresses, the bravery and the type of leather skins that they wore, all that stuff. The Great River, the mounds, they make references to all that stuff that belongs to the Allegui people that we call the Adena and Hopa. But the dating is most definitely previous to their arriving here as we define it as diffusionists. So the story that we're translating, we're able to translate because of the plasma scripts, because it's a universal language. And this proves that the Collbran is legitimate because also the Chinese is legitimate. And we know the Chinese is not under attack. It's not under doubt. There's no doubt as to what the Chinese stuff is meaning. Only what its origins are. Right? Which recalls us of the Babylonian tradition of the one language that became separated and became many. Now, on page 27, we have the names, and that's from which book did this come from? I think this came from the same ancient Welsh grammar book in the orthography section. So we have the names of these runes. So on the left are the shapes, and on the you can see the modern Welsh, how you would say it, and then on the right, the English name. So we're interested in the English primarily, and then over here. Now, we don't go through all of them. We only pick the ones that are of the most interest to us. Okay, and then there's some more also on the following page on 26. And then I include their diagrams, from the book. We see the LL symbol again. We see the Y, etc. And we also see on page 31 examples of the Welsh, the Collbran script in Talison's history from 490 AD. So this is 1,000 years previous to Iolo Morgan. Okay, so there's no way that Iolo makes this up. All right. This is ancient poetry that has existed for more than 1,000 years, people, going right back to the Arthurian age. So the bards kept it alive all that time. So I pick out of here specific runes, and we see this is the crescendo here of the point. So we have light or lober as L, and then open regions, EL is the X, and you can read the rest here. Weapon and separating and plague and gold and the Lord, obviously. And there's probably more that are pertinent, and if anybody wants to do detailed analysis, feel free. So now you go back to Chinese and you look and you find out, do you see concordance with them? And not to spoil it, but yes is the answer. Let's go to, let's look at here, page 33, talking about the spirit, Shen. Shen also means, of course, the god, and it means the symbol kind of looks like the word for middle, center, but it's actually the sun with a big line through it. What are the symbols that we see over here on the etymology for the Chinese? Well, we see the cross and the moving star, like a moving star. We see a man praying. We see two oblate spheres that are connected with the center motif. We see the yin-yang and its origin with a clear stream of energy probably being transferred from one to another. There in L04, was it 528? Yeah. See a couple of thunderbolts. We see also a separation line with something in between and something on the right and something on the left.
Also looks like an S.
Yeah, we have the S showing up. But the point is the right versus the left. And these are some of the runes that we saw often in some of the Welsh. We saw the right and the left. As in this is getting back to the discussion of the separating. So there's the concept of pulling things apart. Okay. We also see in the ARF or AE, it looks like a sideways A, referring possibly to an alpha or to God. But when you turn that sideways, it looks like the weapon. It looks like the weapon. And remember that the word "ge" in Chinese means oneself, but it's also a halberd. And so if you look there on figure 43, on page 32, the weapon is showing the symbols for the Tehran, the T.
Yeah.
And it's showing the downward symbol of the Lord, the Yao shape. And so now the alpha and the weapon, the Ge is oneself, which we also see over there at L08528, sideways V. That symbol shows up in the Collbran as well.
It also looks like karate movements.
It does look a little bit like karate movements.
Yes. Tai Chi, yeah.
So
like that one.
The separation, these are symbols that were coming from the sky.
Yep.
And when we look at gold going down to 35, because remember gold was one of our interesting ones, we see similar words and symbols in the Collbran with the Chinese, but you do not see it with the Futhark and Ogham. Sometimes occasionally with the Futhark, but not really, because it's newer. Whereas the Collbran is ancient, and you can use the Collbran to decipher Hebrew and Etruscan.
That's amazing.
Because the Collbran is from that area, and originally it and the Shang may have come from the same place, from around Babylon, but it would have been a long time antecedent to the events of the Welsh forming the kingdoms of Glamorgan and Gwent, and certainly well antecedent before they came to North America and carved upon runes and merged with the Hopewell people to form the Fort Ancient culture. And obviously the Shang would have been far sundered from them and becoming, after the Shang dynasty, we don't even know what happened to the Shang. Maybe they became the Olmec in South America, or maybe they just were killed out, or maybe they were made into slaves and became part of the Zhou dynasty, which is most likely the case. But we see the same symbols. We see the sideways V symbol there, and we see the same the Yao shape, or Yao, if people would prefer, going down. We see the Jacob's ladder. All these same symbols are showing up in both places in discussing the same words. And I won't go through every single one of the glyphs. People can certainly read the paper.
Yeah.
So as far as I'm concerned, this is basically exact proof that the Collbran is a plasma script, and that therefore the Collbran can be used to read the Welsh stones, and the Welsh stones therefore tell true stories about King Arthur.
That is incredible.
Going on to just covering the what happened here in Kentucky. In the appendices, I have some of the scans from different books and places about possible places where they'd come into Kentucky, and then also some other stones. You can see a much less known stone called the Chi Rho stone. I don't even know where it is. It may be lost forever. We see symbols of a sun exploding. We see symbols that may be referring to Christ.
Fish.
Other signs that pre-Columbian Christians were here.
Yeah.
On plate 5 there on 13. This is again out of Wilson and Blackett. We see the swastika symbol, again symbolizing a great wind, and we know it's wind because the Chinese have also included that X symbol in the word for wind.
I'm not seeing the swastika.
It's right there on the third line, plate 5, page 43. I'm sorry, fourth line. You could see the swastika there.
Oh,
Well,
okay.
when down,
Okay, yeah.
it's pure winds, pure winds. So referring to the blowing of the winds, possibly in destructions, but it could have been the original pure. When you say pure winds, maybe that's a reference to up in the sky.
Mhm.
So up on the actual the plasma flowing, to do with. You could see on 44 where the Kentucky inscription sites tend to be found, and then when you go down and you look on my map of the native sites of Eastern culture in
Mhm.
Plate 7, the gray sites tend to be in the same areas, all above the Falls of the Ohio,
Mhm.
where the Cherokee maintained they slaughtered the mound people at the Falls of the Ohio.
Why would they do
And,
that?
well, and we're going to go through that. If you take a look at this map, there's a couple things to notice. Number one, the Mississippians tend to stay south and west, and they tend to stay off of the archaic mounds. And we talked about those archaic mounds. We talked about them in terms of black earth,
Mhm.
but those ancient people would have been gone a long time.
Mhm.
So why did they stay off of them? They were respectful.
Yeah.
And then the Adena Hopewell and Fort Ancient all to the east, and then also spread around, but the concentration of their culture to the east. Now look at the separation between them. That's what, my friend, that's what you call a separation of two states. All
Yeah.
right, so we have a contest of powers. When the Welsh came here after the comet, the electrical comet of
Mhm.
535 that destroyed the fields of Glamorgan and Logres, and then went down and struck in Peru. The When they came here, they established forts out of stone, such as the so-called Indian Fort in Berea, and the stone fort I mentioned there at Charlestown State Park that was dismantled to make that big Fort Bridge. Which, by the way, they still don't want you going up on that hill. If you go to Charlestown State Park, they don't want you going up there, and they say it's owned by somebody else and all this stuff. It's part of a state park, but they don't want you to go up on top of the hill because they don't want you looking for evidence of the Welsh that were there,
Yeah.
and all these different stone sites. So all of these tend to be on this side because they had a control of the lanes, the ancient lanes going up to the Michigan Copper. And they also wanted to have control of the fluorspar mines that are between, because the Kentucky and Illinois have the largest fluorite mines in the world. And fluorspar is used in smelting of iron. Whereas the Mississippians were able to maintain control of the areas that had a lot of pearls, and obviously they controlled the source of the river. Now, they appear to have been wiped out primarily by smallpox brought by the Chinese, but we don't know for sure. It could have been some other disease. I mean, if the Welsh were here, we presume that the Welsh did not come up Mississippi because they wouldn't have been able to get very far, but it came down the St. Lawrence and came because that's the way the Welsh stones seem to indicate is they came from Nova Scotia and down the St. Lawrence and then came down through Pittsburgh and all that, and then established relations with the Hopewell here. But then they were wiped out. King Arthur was killed here, according
Yeah.
to the
How did
Welsh
that
account.
happen?
Basically, they snuck up behind him and killed him. It wasn't super easy, barely an inconvenience. I mean, they just snuck up behind him and killed him. And then his body was shipped back in a sack, and his mummified remains were left in a cave in Wales until his son was old enough to take power, and then he was buried under a church. And Wilson and Blackett bought that church, thinking they would get the permission to dig up the body, and they did not. They denied that, and they are sold. They're ready to perish. I mean, and like true bards, they've had long lives of study. They put everything on the line: their mortgages, their careers, blah blah blah, for the secret, for the knowledge,
Yeah.
which is what the true bards have always done.
And they're
So
immediately cast as outlaws,
basically, when they put out that Arcturus Rex book, that was pretty much the end.
Yeah.
And yet it was the beginning for all of the rest of us. And unfortunately for them, they came at the end of the age of just books, and they published so much of this stuff without putting it onto the internet. That's why it's important for people like us to go forward and actually can translate the stuff and put it on the internet.
Absolutely.
And to make connections that they couldn't possibly make, right?
Yeah.
Remember Wilson came here and predicted there would be a Longburrow mound a mile from the mouth of Mount Horeb. But I was looking at it from the Saturnian myth and from the Thunderbolt strike, because it was only 20 kilometers from the giant Thunderbolt strike site. And yet he was correct. There was a Longburrow mound there. So this religion, it's not diffusion versus electric universe. The electric universe explains both the travel of diffusion and the similarities. Yes, there weren't ancient Jews making the menorah mound in the Midwest of North America, but it wasn't like they were completely different people. They had the same belief in an above Lord and the same belief in his power and the rays of energy coming off, right? And whatever that symbolized in the ancient days, that later on became, of course, the menorah. And whatever it meant to the natives here. But it meant something. They would have been able, I don't know if they'd been able to speak together, but they would have been able to worship together, most assuredly. So I maintain that they came here, then they had trouble. They were wiped out that first time. Then they came back again, one of the lost Roman legions. They came back. They established an even stronger fortress because they knew all about this region. They intermingled with the Hopewell because the Hopewell would have been weaker by then, and disease and warfare with the Mississippians, who probably, where did the Mississippians probably come from? Most probably Mexico.
What
right?
happened to the Anastasians? Was it the Anastasi? Do you know?
No, I do not know. I don't tend to study any of the southwestern natives as much. It is a big weakness of mine. I do tend to focus in this area because it has so many connections to our culture via the Arthurian myth and all that. Yeah. So they established this alliance. They formed the Fort Ancient culture. They're building real forts. Why would they need to build forts? Because they were under attack. They had fear. Why did they have fear? Because they were doing commerce. They were doing things that were unsacred and unholy. They were using wheels and had writing, and they were living near mound sites or on mound sites and establishing their own fortifications. And how do we know this? Because getting back to the conspiracy of the government to hide things on the federal base in Madison County, Kentucky, there is a giant mound site which has mounds conforming to Lyra and more importantly Cygnus, forming a Christian cross, a giant Christian cross with, as you can expect, the Tehran or Yao symbol, 100-foot earthwork next to it, stamped almost to say, yes, we were here and this is our religion. And it's a giant cross, and they date that site to the 1100s. Most definitely pre-Columbian, and they had agriculture. And this is in the area that we see very nearby connections to the runic sites and connections to the serpent mounds and connections to the conical mounds, all in this area you see on plate 7 in the orange and gray and blue area on the right.
Mm-hmm.
And then what happened to them? Most probably they got into a war. Probably the Cherokee did band together and come out of Tennessee and Georgia and North Carolina and come up and probably joined powers with the Iroquoians and may have even brought water powers up from Mexico to support the Mississippians to fight. But then later on, it didn't matter. The Chinese came along and smallpox, and that's a different story. But in the early 1500s, the smallpox came in and wiped out the Mississippians anyways. And the Cherokee were so wiped out, they were reduced to nobody occupying Kentucky anymore for hundreds of years. The stories of the blood and the war here, and in fact, the natives were quite surprised that Daniel Boone's people wanted to live in Kentucky because of the ghosts, and the giants and the mummies that were left behind from all these wars that were just a few hundred years antecedent. We see here the king on the page 46, the plate 8, the King Arthur II and Madoc, suspected sites in Kentucky, which includes fortifications and certain mounds. And they do overlap the strategic control of the Falls of the Ohio, which is a giant waterfall and shipping lane, and of course, this central bluegrass region.
There's something that came into my mind that I have to remember to tell you, but
sure,
go ahead. Well, I'll wait.
That's pretty much it. I mean, I just show a little bit of the family tree on plate 8, and I just have a little quote there. And I'd like to end with the last quote. Arthur II died in 579. Simplified genealogy gives a chronological placement for Urian Reged of the gift as Taliesin, the chief bard of Arthur II, moved the court of Urian Reged after Arthur II's funeral in 580. Detailed genealogies serve to tie in the numbers of 6th century personalities. That's from the Wilson Blackett text. And I will say also that they have a fantastic amount of information using the Land of Charters and using all of the Christian information. That's how we know that they're doing real legitimate work. They're looking at Christian records that come out of the Bibles, and they're finding names. And these guys all had family members who were royalty. So the royalty and the priests were wrapped up together. So you can follow the bloodlines of the priests, and you get the bloodlines of the royal families going back to Arthur, which then goes back to the first Arthur, who defeated the Romans and Caesar, and then goes all the way back to Brutus of Troy. And at the time that they were eliminating the Welsh's right to have a language and a culture, they were saying that YOLO was a fake and a fraud. And then what happened? Within 20 years, they found Troy, and then they never came back and admitted that they were wrong. And the American government has definitely covered up sites here in Kentucky. And for whatever reason, maybe Thomas Jefferson was afraid that the British would make war, but I don't see why that would need to be. Why they would need to hide it in the late 1800s. And in the 20th century, as far as I know, the Bluegrass Army base with the chemical weapons on it is a 20th century base. Why would they build over top of a site with a giant Christian cross? Probably there are government documents talking about the likelihood of this. But for sure, they only allow one archaeologist site access to the whole thing, and she focuses on pottery from the field where they do where the agriculture is shown. She doesn't care about mounds. She doesn't care about the cross. She doesn't care about the Tehran symbol, the Yao. All right, we care about it because it shows the concordance of the way humans used to live and how we used to understand each other.
Yeah,
of course,
that's true, Pass.
We didn't get along, but that's because we learned from the gods' war. 7,000 years ago, we learned that war was okay. Which is silly. I mean, it's amazing. You're listening to in the Iliad, right? You have these people, and they are thinking that the pestilence is coming upon them because of things that they have, the wars they've had with Nestor and Ceres and the Trojans and all this stuff, right? They think that that's why the gods are moving up in the sky. I mean, mankind thought that we had this intimate relationship with these giant spheres, that they were like people. And it's been a huge fallacy that has caused us a huge number of problems. We learned a lot of technology, and we learned a lot of war. Of course, a lot of technology comes from our military to this day, including the internet.
This actually, it provides the missing information, actually. I watched a video by the New Earth channel a year or so ago, and it starts with Chief Joseph surrendering to, I think, a Spanish general, and he gives him a Somali tablet or a Sumerian tablet. And he's like, where did you get this? And he said, white men were here before you, and they treated us better. And the chief gave this to my father. And it turns out that, according to the New Earth Channel and this video, they knew of a last vestige in the Pacific Northwest that had gone there because they were just tired of wars and being wiped out and all this. But she, according to that video, she didn't have any information of how they got there, and this is that information.
Yeah, I mean, diffusion is a fact.
Oh,
it's
absolutely.
Just there's no doubt that people diffused. But the timing is everything. You know, we can't use diffusion to explain everything. There's these people that want to run around and say the Vera coaches were everywhere. Graham Hancock is one of those people. The white man said, I mean, that's not what that story means. But he's interpreting it that way. Why? Because he is descendant of the para-Victorians and the Victorians, and so unfortunately, as good a person as Graham Hancock is, and he's married to a woman, she's a person of color, so he doesn't mean it this way, but he comes across bringing this idea that these ancient Atlantean white people were going all over the world. That's not what that story is about. But at the same time, it's not like it's not true that there weren't diffusions, and that there weren't Atlanteans, and that they weren't settling, and that they weren't becoming Phoenicians, and my ancestry, the Basque people, and possibly Algonquians, these different cultures moving about. I mean, I have a theory that the Amazonians came from this area, from Kentucky, because of the dark earths. And so where were they? But we don't have any evidence in between, because they left here around the Exodus period and went in search of new lands, or they were wiped out, one of the two. And then somehow there's people forming the same kind of mounds and creating tree crops in the Amazon, but now after the age of the birth of Christ. So what happened for those 2,000 years in between? Well, it ostensibly it would take a while to sail along and intermingle, and maybe your people are enslaved with the Mayans, etc. I mean, who knows? Or maybe the secret was always here and it was passed along, and there was a lot of trade routes. There may have been a triangle trade going from the mouth of the Amazon to those inner cities of the Amazonians, up to the copper mines, all the way at the Great Lakes, and then all the way down over to the Yucatan and Mexico, first with the Mayans and then with the Aztecs. And this triangle trade may have been interrupted by these Welsh interlopers who came in and seized the Falls of the Ohio, and that may have angered the tribe, and maybe a naval power came along. I can tell you, when I went to the Toltec site in Arkansas, which they discredit as Toltec now, I most definitely, I looked at this, I was like, this is a naval power. I can tell this is a naval power. But it might have been just boats, like canoe boats. But at some point, there was an empire here. If you go to the Old Stone Fort in Tennessee, and you can't tell me, if you're standing in the middle of that, and you're surrounded on all sides by rivers with big mounds and cliffs around it, that this is not the site of an ancient fort power. But it wasn't the Spanish, and it wasn't the Welsh, because it's too large. It's too large for them to defend it. It had to be a big group. And then they say, well, we don't find any bodies here. Well, I'm like, well, yeah, because the site was industrialized, and colonial people destroyed all sorts of native stuff. They dug up things. They were, burning remains. I mean, of course you're not going to find signs of it, but it's too large to be defended. And there's no other ostensible use of these walls that go all the way around on the edge of a cliff between two rivers. Yeah. Right? This is most definitely a fort. So what are we looking for? We're looking for an empire that is either of the same period or just after the period of Poverty Point. Because Poverty Point, its power was, its commerce was centered probably halfway between the Mexican powers and the copper mines in Michigan, because we don't know where all that copper has gone, right?
Right.
And so
We don't.
why was it interrupted? Because all the dating in the site shows that it was interrupted in the time of the Exodus, 1500 BC to 1700 BC, somewhere in there.
Yeah.
See,
Last time I misspoke. I said that it seemed that mankind was more peaceful. What I really meant to say was it seemed like mankind was more accepting of different races. Would that be a fair statement?
yeah, I mean, everybody was racist, but it
Yeah.
wasn't like it wasn't considered a wrong thing. I mean, the thing is that back in the day, we get the feeling like the Irish got it real bad. The Irish were just as racist against the English and against the Scots and against the Italians. When they came to America, the Irish were mistreated. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah.
But they were racist against the Italians. I mean, and these are all different white people. That's the way it was.
Yeah.
If you came from just a different part in Greece, if you came from Athens or Sparta, the Greeks who came from Barbaros were barbarians.
Right.
And to us, I met a Chinese. We had a Chinese teacher, and she was teaching us Mandarin, of course. And I asked her where she's from, and she said this part, and I said, "Oh, where's that at?" Manchuria. Oh, Manchuria. And she said, "Oh, but I'm Han Chinese." She was so worried about which kind of Chinese, and of course Western. I'm like, it's
like that everywhere.
It's the same, I mean, it's like, what are they, what are they worried about? Because in most parts of the world, it still matters.
Oh yeah.
So
and I know the Hindus it does.
Everyone was racist, but it wasn't necessarily racist in a way like they wanted to get hang them or something. I mean, in Africa, it's hard for us to imagine. In Rwanda, the amount of death between the Hutu and the Tutsis, but that's because to us in the West, they all look like they're all Africans, but over there's tremendous difference between them, and that's the whole world was that way. Yes, it was tremendous violence, but also at times they could find ways to understand each other. And one way they understood each other was commerce. So if the Welsh came in there with their horses and their armor, and they're making stone fortifications, and they're practicing the ancient religion, but they're practicing it their weird way, all right? And they're using wheels. I mean, that would be anathema if you're a Mississippian. And you understand you're like, oh, well, the Hopewells build conical mounds, but these people, they do, they make these stone graves and all these other kinds of things. And we use platform mounds. I mean, there's just a difference, and you can see it reflected in that map. I mean, there's a tension that I can see from different sides of the Ohio River Valley, and I have no doubt that the Cherokee myths are true. And why they aren't taught in schools, I don't know. Because I guess the racism of our country, unfortunately, the native stuff is just not taught. And I can tell you from the Hidden Kentucky Project, the waterfalls that are the most polluted in Kentucky have the word Indian in them. So it's just an unfortunate thing where the myths are being wiped out. But it also happened to other white cultures that weren't our stream of culture. Like I say, the Arthurian myths were stolen and they were injected. And now you have like Disney, right? The Disney film and the good old king in London town. This didn't happen in London. There was no London. What are they talking about? London was probably some fort cemetery at the time, some Roman fort cemetery.
Yeah.
London was nothing compared to the Glamorgan and Gwent at that time. So the King Arthur legends did not happen in England. And the information was stolen, and then it was buried, and it was covered up, and then all attempts to say that it's legitimate were poo-pooed by saying that Yola made it up, and that there's no such thing as Troy. And it turns out both of those things are lies, because you have ruins going back to the histories of Taliesin, and you have stones dating well previous to the 1000s, and you have Yolos using a script which is definitely decipherable in multiple cultures. Not saying that you would get an English turn of phrase out of it, but the symbols would mean something to ancient people from the Hebrews, the Etruscans, the Chinese, and probably the Native Americans. Probably at least the people in this valley. Now, could it have been that the Welsh came over here and then they failed 2 or 3 times? Yeah, it's possible, but I don't maintain that because we only know from the Welsh stones they came after the 300s, and probably 535, and then later on in the 1000s, and established a colony until they were wiped out. And why were they wiped out? They were wiped out not, by the way, not that long before the Chinese got here. Right. And by the way, here's a question. In the To the Gates of Feng Tu, the very opening sections, the Chinese sail to Mecca. And then the people at Mecca tell them about America. Now, riddle me this. How did the people at Mecca know about it? Right?
Yeah.
That's the Chinese. It says it very specifically. This text has only been translated within the last few years. It's a Chinese text that goes back to the 1400s. They meet the Muslims. You can tell. There's no doubt. They talk very specifically, and because Islam doesn't change very much at all, you can tell that it is Mecca. There is no doubt about it that they are in Mecca, and the description of how they got there by going around Africa, everything is in there. Okay, and the Chinese are talking to them, and they agree. They don't want to, one doesn't want to become Buddhist and the other one doesn't want to become Muslim, but they like each other. They get along anyways. And then they ask them about, well, we're ready to go home because we've reached the end of the world and we've seen Europe and all this stuff. And he says, no, you've got to go over to America. I mean, I'm paraphrasing. And they're like, well, where's that? And they're like, go out the way that you came in through the straits, then sail thence another 1 or 2 months.
Yeah.
Right. So they spend 3 months. It's in the book, in Chinese, and then they first end up running into the southern Mississippian cultures, and then they go on up, and then they run straight up into the Cahokians, and they describe Cahokia almost perfectly, and thereby spread they spread smallpox, and then when they bring the story back to the Ming Emperor, that's when they burn a lot of the records in order to hide evidence, because they were supposed to bring Buddhism around the world. Instead, they brought pestilence that wiped. I mean, it was a huge disaster. It was a PR disaster. But how did the Chinese know? They knew because the people at Mecca and Medina knew. And how did they know? Because everybody knew. Only our culture did not know. Columbus, it was not a super genius. He was buying maps off of people who knew, and those people knew because they got those maps from other people who got them from other people who had been here.
Yeah.
Now, it's just not feasible to have the expenses to go to America just any time. You have to have good reason. Arthur had a good reason. A comet came by, burned up Glamorgan and Gwent, so they came over.
Yeah.
You had to have good reason because there were people who lived here, and they were killers. The whole world was killers, and enslaving. Everybody was enslaving. Native Americans owned slaves. African Americans owned slaves. And people could look this up. I mean, everybody owned slaves. So it was just a violent world. It was a violent time. But diffusion is a fact. Everybody was going everywhere.
Completely captivating talk, Ramon. I enjoyed every minute of it. Yeah,
certainly.
What's that?
It certainly got me animated.
Oh no, that's great. I like that about you. You're into your work. I like this one over here on the right, analysis and science of Greco-Roman, Nordic culture, and the zodiac days related.
Yeah. That's a smaller paper that I did that shows some of the plasma scripts.
I'm going to have to read that. I'm into anything.
It's not a bad one. I like the short ones a lot. I like the one on the Ferris wheel too, and
I'll get into
all
that.
that kind of stuff. Yeah, I find all of this. The sumo paper is one of the shorter-ish ones. I mean, it's only in the 20s.
The origins of religion. Oh, I'm going to have to check that out.
That's one of that one's one of the.
Well, maybe we should do that.
The origins of that's the origins of all my work, honestly, because that and describing what is EPEMC, which, to clarify for people, anybody, it's open source cosmology. Any of you all can do it. I don't own a copyright to EPEMC. Okay, just if you believe in plasma electromagnetic cosmology, and if you like extra stuff, You can think of the E as extra. It means extended, but and you can think of it as extra stuff. You like Atlantis. You like diffusion. You like King Arthur. Whatever. Just show evidence and bring it all together. Write good papers. Cite all your work. You make even better looking Oxford style papers. I'm an engineer, so I don't believe in that. So I put a footnote and put the link right there. I don't really care for all this highfalutin, and I put a name and it's all mysterious. Where am I going to get that source? And you got to go to the library. That's a nightmare. I give you the link. Boom, you get right to it. It's the whole point of the internet, in my opinion.
What is
anybody
Futhark?
can write the papers in any style they want. And so I explained that in one of the PMC papers, but on the origins is where I really laid out the timeline I saw, at least at the time that I had written that, which is before I had read a few things and done certainly some of this research, this Arthurian research, before I had found a Thunderbolt strike site and all this stuff. But it's a great paper. It's got a lot of symbols, a lot of diagrams and things like that. Also wrote another long paper. There's several long papers in mine. The Atlantis one's pretty long. The plasma electromagnetic sky is medium long. But the magnetic universe theory, that one is like the one that we just did, the plasma glyph one. The magnetic universe theory, that's a really long one. It's all alt stream discussions, pretty much. I mean, alt stream discussions of electromagnetism. And I'm refuting the idea that you can eliminate electricity and just talk about magnetism, just as I would refute the idea that you can just talk about electricity and eliminate magnetism. I hear this from time to time. I always find it amazing to me because you can go buy two magnets and you can tell that there's no electricity happening. I know that a lot of people haven't had a proper education in electromagnetism by going to college, and then there are people going to say, well, then you're just indoctrinated. I'm not indoctrinated, folks. It's just that I'm telling you that there are things about electromagnetism where you can dualize the one force into electricity or to magnetism. Of course, for all of us, I say plasma electromagnetism to combine the idea to get to, I say in the magnetic universe theory paper, I say that the PEM, the PEM, is the unified ether theory that everyone's looking for. We don't need to look anymore. We found it.
Unified ether theory.
Yeah, the unified ether theory. Right? Everybody's looking for a unified field, blah, blah, blah. We don't need to go looking for a new one. That's the problem with the science. They keep looking for a new one, and then they have to invent dark stuff and all that. It's like they went right by the exit. We have it. What we don't do is understand it. That's the issue. We have models, but not knowledge.
Oh, I know. I agree. You're right.
Did you say what's Futhark?
What is Futhark?
Oh, that's just another runic system. That's a modern. It's a late Middle Ages runic system. It's not ancient.
Yeah.
Ancient, I guess, to a 7-year-old, but not ancient to a historian or a bard. Collbran is ancient, right? It's going all the way back to the cataclysms and the gods. And that's why Welsh had a real legitimate religion and story. And the Arthurian stuff, yes, it has the reflections of the symbology, the floating island and the crescent boat and the cosmic hill, because they were using it to rule their people. It has every place in the world that legitimately is old did. And by the way, in another paper I discuss, all those cultures with those great memories, they're all hyper-masculine cultures. Or you might say machismo. Every single one of them. And can we blame that on the Mars-Venus affair, or is it maybe going all the way back to Zeus himself? I don't know. But they do tend to be mountainous places. So these mountainous places do tend to be hyper-masculine places. And all of them have great cultural memory of the events that happened in the skies. It's harder to oust people from the hills, They just keep their religion alive. Same thing here in Kentucky, the Appalachians, some of the, Christianity as it dies throughout the country and becomes something else, something about positivism and something about singing rock songs. It stays most true to its evangelical and Puritanist roots in Appalachia. And that's because those kind of cultures, they just tend to remember things, but they also tend to be hyper-masculine cultures, or what some people will call patriarchal, which is such a become such an unfortunate term to deride, but those cultures tend to survive for a reason. They have advantages. There's advantages.
Cultures of fear.
You could say it, but see, it's such a we put such a negative spin on it. You know, I like it. I explain it to people as the difference between lions and tigers. Tigers are perfectly egalitarian, and therefore the females are single mothers that raise the single cubs, and it's very difficult for them to survive. Whereas lions are patriarchal and one male lion sitting on a copy, and they breed at fantastic rates. But they live in a much more dangerous realm, a lot more super predators around them. So the females benefit from the presence of the male lion. And by the way, those male lions die probably the most violent deaths outside of the insect world.
They do.
It's brutal.
Horrible.
I mean, every single one of them, if they're fortunate, they die of disease. You know, none of them die of old age. Not a single one.
No doubt. So, I know. I've seen many things on lions. I've been into them for a long time. Yeah, it's just a brutal world.
Lions, yes, it is. But the female lions derive protection and help in raising the young. I mean, the males help in raising the young. That's not true with tigers.
I mean, now you're starting to see prides being run by 2 and 3 males.
Yeah, well, they have to. It's an arms race because I've seen a video with three male super pride with a father and 2 sons get totally destroyed by 5 males.
Yep, I saw that. I saw that one.
And that's an arms race.
And
because
they were all hunted down one at a time.
Yeah.
By another pride.
It's brutal the way they die. But my point is that the people misunderstand these cultures, and that's because they don't understand the origins of these things going back to survival of the cataclysms.
Yep.
And that's where hypermasculinity becomes useful. Now, I think going too far is not good, obviously. But there's a reason why these cultures survive. The Japanese, the Greeks, the Mexicans, the Scandinavians. I mean, the Vikings were notoriously hypermasculine. Meaning you could get in a duel if you said a man was girly.
Hypermasculine. I like that.
Very hypermasculine. So that's a great little paper that I put out. But it's been my pleasure. I hope people go and review some of the papers, especially the Chinese ones. The sumo paper is people love that paper. It's a lot of fun. Right. I mean, a lot of people find it as a funny little sport with big fat people, but it makes complete sense using the plasma electromagnetic cosmology.
I gotta check it out. I'm gonna have to read that. It's just been, it's been captivating and inspiring, Ramon. I appreciate it. I'm going to get all the questions together, and we're going to do this again, maybe in a stream.
Yeah, and my God, I sure hope people go and buy the Wilson Blackett and McCann texts and really get into these Arthurian myths because it's worth it.
I can tell you that I will.
I'll buy it.
Yeah.
All right,
man. It's been a pleasure, buddy. I'll talk to you soon.
If you need help on that, by the way, you can go to akha.us or Ancient Kentucky with an E at the end instead of a Y.com. Okay. There's a book section, and the books are listed on the left. And those PayPal links go to George because if you go on the Amazon, you're probably going to see people trying to sell you copies for $100.
That's good advice. Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, those are scams, of course.
I'll put them in the description of this video.
Okay.
Yeah, for sure. All right, Ramon. Until next time, buddy.
Okay.
Have a good time. Thanks again.
Have a good night.
All right, you too. Bye-bye.